Greetings. Welcome to the Center for Global Development. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel. I had the privilege of working with these ministers in an earlier incarnation. It's wonderful to see them all back. And I want to take this opportunity to welcome you and other guests to this panel. Turn it over to Nancy Birdsall.
Thank you very much, Masood. That was very quick. Good for you. We have a very tight schedule, and we want to have time to hear from everyone who's on this call with us or this Zoom with us. It's a pleasure for me as well, particularly to remember two old friends. One, the author of our book, Kostas Mikolopoulos, whom I met, in the 1980s when he was in the chief economist's office at the World Bank as a tough-minded trade economist in the days when we believed that the marketplace had the magic to bring development. And of course, Evelyn, whom I also got to know, I didn't know her personally, but I admired her when she was, I think, one of the only women on the World Bank board and a forceful and influential member of the board. So Evelyn is, of course, a member of the Utstein Group. This also takes me back to the early days of CGD when we had the Commitment to Development Index, which lives on, but was inspired in part by the Utstein Group's focus on policy cohesion, that aid matters, but many issues of rich countries, many policy approaches of rich countries on trade, technology, migration, and so forth, all those matter as well. And the Utstein Group was the champion of this concept of policy cohesion. So we're here really, in my view, to celebrate a wonderful book, just wonderfully presented, beautifully written. And it does take me back to those halcyon early days of the Millennium Development Goals. But the author, Kostas Mikolopoulos, brings us all the way forward to the situation today with the SDGs. And he presents the question and the problem and the challenge of turning the SDGs into something that's more of a movement. 17 great goals don't generate the kind of attention that's needed. And so I want to say all of this brings us back to early days, but Kostas brings us forward also into what looks like a difficult, challenging future. I also want to mention that and acknowledge we got some comments on the lack of global representation at this event. This is really a donor kind of set of faces, isn't it, in a way? So we want to acknowledge that, and I hope we were remiss in not thinking about how all of these issues, that including the wonderful issues, tough issues that Kostas raises, we don't have someone today to really give us a sense of how it's seen from in the rest of the world, and in particular in countries that are still the recipients of not only aid, but sometimes the victims of other policies, including in trade and climate, where the rich world isn't doing as well as it ought to. So we hope to hear from any of you out there with comments or questions that bear on this question of what about the views of the recipients still, unfortunately, in a way, the less powerful countries and people in the world. So with that, let me go straight to introducing Konstantin, known as Kostas Mikolopoulos, who will have 10 minutes. Kostas is the author of the book we're celebrating, Ending Global Poverty, For Women's Noble Conspiracy. I knew him at the World Bank. Before that, he had been a senior person at USAID. He's the adjunct professor at American University and at the SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And most important, he's still thinking and writing. So over to you, Costas. Tell us about your book.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I want to thank Nancy and Masood and the colleagues at CGD for organizing this launch. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today. The center has been one of the preeminent institutions globally and has provided leadership both in analysis and in advocacy on ways to address the issues of the developing world broadly and to eradicate poverty. I must say that it was also the first institution globally to recognize the role played by the four Utstein ministers by giving them an award in, I believe, 2001 or 2, something like that. Also reminding me of good friends, Nancy and I actually went to China in 1983 when she was in charge of the World Development Report, which was supposed to be on population policy. I was giving the Chinese the advice on macroeconomic and trade issues, and she did it on population. And I think they listened to us, and they did very well since that time. Masood was one of my bosses when I was in Geneva in the late 80s. This volume, late 90s, I should say. This volume is their volume. It is the Utstein Minister's volume. I helped them put it together based on their interviews with them, based on their writings, their correspondence, their speeches. It is really their book. I also, of course, did use national and international archives, including from the IMF, which was not easy. Then I had a lot of interviews with lots of people, some of them on this panel, and also many of them in the audience. And I want to thank all of them for the help they provided in putting this book together. They also pointed a couple of mistakes that I made in the printed edition, so I'm doubly grateful to them. Let me say a few words about the relevance of the Utstein story for today's challenges. The global pandemic requires global multilateral action to provide additional resources to poor countries and offset the increase in poverty caused by the virus. And this is a virus that also has hurt the poor more than anybody else, disproportionately hurting the poor both in developed and in developing countries. The global pandemic requires global multilateral action. What the Utstein Four did is of relevance today for a number of reasons. First, as Masood and the CGD have been continuing to emphasize, multilateral debt relief for poor countries is essential, especially in Africa. Just like, in fact, the developing countries needed debt relief at the time the Utstein Four got together and started to push for debt relief in the late 1990s, and to make sure that the debt relief actually releases resources which go to the poor and to eradicate poverty domestically. Second, and I don't think it is fashionable these days to talk about concessional assistance, assistance in general, official development assistance generally, call it what you want. More assistance is needed today in order to help developing countries address the situation and the challenges they face. And it is one of those things that the Utstein Four did in the 1990s when they pushed and successfully got the European Union to produce large amounts of additional resources for the developing countries at that time. These resources are needed today as well. Third, one of the things that the Utstein ministers did is to promote the importance of aid effectiveness. In many respects, aid effectiveness is the Utstein signature issue. And it's an issue that Nancy, you yourself have worked on very effectively over the years and gave a lot of publicity to the issue surrounding the implementation of the aid process, both on the developed and on the developing country side. It needs to be revived so that resources are used efficiently and effectively. The Utstein ministers stressed through their emphasis on budget support that all resources, including those of the developing countries, that those that developing countries themselves control, have to be used effectively. Next, I want to turn to another aspect of the Utstein story. It's not only what they did on debt and resources and effectiveness of aid, it is how they did it, which requires some interesting comments, some comments about the relevance of how they did it to today's challenges. The first point is their leadership. They were strong, substantive, articulate, and they spoke with one voice. Second, they showed a willingness to work and stand up for global objectives, even when, in fact, these objectives were contrary to narrow national interests. We need more of this today. Third, collaboration is unglamorous. It requires a willingness to work hard with others and submerge individual egos, and they did thus. And finally, I must say that I've read some studies which show that women tend to exhibit those characteristics of collaborative behavior much more commonly than men. We are at a turning point in history. Individual behavior is critical to societal and global success in reversing the COVID damage. This requires leadership. I'm going to conclude with quoting from the book's dedication to Greta, Malala, Nadia, and the new generation of young leaders. Humanity's best hope to eradicate poverty and achieve sustainable development. The new leaders, whoever they are, would benefit from looking at the Utstein Four experience. They should develop their own conspiracy of implementation. This is what Hilde originally said about what they were doing. And give priority to developed country actions to support the efforts of poor developing countries to eradicate extreme poverty on a sustainable basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masood. Impressively short for a book that is so rich, but I loved that you emphasized several things, including the Utstein Group was a group that knew how to collaborate, and perhaps it's not a coincidence it was for female ministers. Now we're going to hear from 3 members of the Utstein Group. They each get only 5 minutes. It's really not enough. And then we're going to hear from, with comments from 2 people who have been there and were there over the years on the aid and policy coherence issues, Jim Adams and Bert Kunders. Let's start with Hilda Johnson, another old friend who has been not only the Minister of International Development of Norway in the early years of the 2000s and a champion of the MDGs. Hilda has been the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, so she knows where it's at in terms of really the children and the poor who the MDGs and the SDGs are all about. Hilda, it's so nice to see you again. This is a woman of great energy and spirit, soul. Go for it, Hilda. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Here we go. Now you can hear me, right? Thank you for this opportunity. And I just want to show everyone the book since it hasn't been shown properly before. And let me just thank Costas, the author of it, for his brilliant work. And not least for his patience with all four of us, because we can really be a tall order. And the story of the Utstein Group is a story worth telling, however, and not because of the name, which comes from an old, beautiful abbey in my constituency close to Stavanger, where I was an elected MP in Norway. But it was a wonderful occasion to conspire, and that's what we did for a number of years. And as Costas rightly said, we hope this book can be, and our story can be, an inspiration to new leaders. The challenges are great, and I think our experience shows that it is possible to confront conventional wisdom and power and actually succeed. So that's what we really hope can be the lesson and the story from our experience. For us, it was really about eradicating poverty, and our collective passion was making it happen, halving the number in extreme poverty. And indeed, the advocacy for the International Development Goals actually led the groundwork for the MDGs to be agreed and to later be implemented. So that was an important achievement in itself. But we were not satisfied with lofty promises, with the glorious international goals. We wanted to avoid what always happened, which was that business as usual prevailed. We wanted rhetoric to be translated into reality. We wanted words to be translated into deeds. And for that to happen, we needed to conspire. So the conspiracy of implementation was what we were all about, and which was what we drafted and got together to agree on at Utstein. First, we knew that countries could never develop from the outside. They had to do that themselves. They had to be in the driver's seat of their own development. We just had to make it easier for them, not more difficult. So empowering our partners implied really respecting country ownership and ending what we called the donor circus of zillions of donor-driven, uncoordinated projects. Tide aid even made more money go back to donor countries rather than reaching the poor. We made a major push for change. Donors had to coordinate and work together rather than going it alone. They should untie their aid, lower their own flags, and pool their resources together. We succeeded in getting several of these donor reforms through, including in the OECD DAC, and we also pushed the World Bank hard to do the same, to change from structural adjustment to country-owned PRSPs, poverty reduction strategies. The second we tried was to get the resources needed to act. We successfully advocated for increased levels of ODA and for more donors and the EU to commit to 0.7% of GDP, which we also achieved with several ahead of the Monterrey summit, and making all aid money more poverty focused. This implied giving priority to the poorest countries within our own aid programs, refocusing our aid and advocating for the same also with others. To make most effective use of aid, we advocated for budget support, as Costas said, which enabled the countries themselves to be in the driver's seat, holding their own line ministries and donors to account. There was clear evidence at the time that this improved transparency and financial controls, not the opposite. So fighting corruption was always high on our agenda. So shifting from projects to this and to sector-wide programs in education and health, supported by pooled donor basket funds, was another change. And in this way, countries could deliver services to their own people and make a real difference in the lives of millions, not only individual donor-supported schools and health clinics with their own flags on top. We all declined any ribbon-cutting ceremonies, to, I think, our officials' shock, in our partner countries, and told our staff to make sure the country's own leadership would get the credit. This was how credibility could be built for the reforms the countries were undergoing. Third, we knew that aid alone would never make it. Many other policies were affecting poor countries, as Nancy, you were saying, sometimes more, such as trade, FDI, and of course, debt. We had to ensure coherence between all those factors influencing developing countries and their economy. As Utstein ministers, we confronted our colleagues in cabinet on these issues, our own colleagues, and pushed hard for change, both at home and in international fora. The coherence agenda was difficult, but very important. Among our biggest battles was reforming HIPC, making it more pro-poor, introducing the PRSPs, and fighting for HIPC to write off the debt of all heavily indebted poor countries. The fact that we were ministers from 2 G7 countries and 2 countries from the so-called like-minded group of donor countries helped. Heidi and Claire pushed within the G7 hard. We pushed from the outside. And of course, the mobilization through the Jubilee campaign made a huge difference. The World Bank's own Wolfenson and IMF's Come to See, and a few of the finance ministers became good allies. The 4 of us played good cop, bad cop in a very coordinated fashion at the World Bank meetings. You can just guess who's who, sometimes driving our colleagues mad. There are some good stories about this in the book, I have to say. Kostas has recorded them well. And that was how we also won the fight over HIPC financing. Instead of letting other poor countries foot the bill through borrowing the money from IDA, the bank's concessional window, the funding gap was filled by sales of IMF gold. If someone had told me years before that the sale of IMF gold would help fund debt relief for poor countries in the world, I would have told them to get real. I would have laughed. And this brings me actually to my final point, which is what can be achieved if you work together. As Claire said, we can, and I miss her today, so we'll hope to get her on board later for more launches. We can make a bigger fist, Claire said in her usual rhetoric. In the U4, we agreed on a division of labor and who would be most effective in carrying the message when. The others would come in behind and support. It was true sisterhood, actually. And we made sure we were not alone. Our teams worked together, ensuring in our respective ministries institutional anchor at home and in the field to make sure our conspiracies actually were implemented. And in doing so, and many of you will probably not believe this, we did not have time for personal egos and vanity. What we wanted to achieve was so much bigger than each one of us. So we chose to disregard that. The sale of IMF gold is but one example of how this way of working can make a difference. It shows that change is possible. It always is. Even the most unrealistic goals can be achieved. It is about how you work together to make it happen. Of course, it's also about timing. It is about leadership and geopolitical trends. And we are now in a difficult time. But still, the tide never turns all by itself. There are people that influence the currents and that ultimately also influence the tide. And that's why I'm so happy that Kostas has dedicated the book to these young, wonderful new leaders that are coming, girls that can take this challenge up. This is what we think and hope can inspire them. Never say never. Be bold. Start influence the currents. Work together, many of you. Conspire, and together you will help turn the tide. We rely on you. You can make it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. Energy, as I said, and just so well, beautifully stated what the Utstein Group was about. And I'm so glad you mentioned IMF Gold. It reminds me of one of the first CGD books, which had the title, Debt, the IMF, and the New Aid Architecture, or something like that. Or IMF Gold and the New Aid Architecture. We now go to Heidi Marie Wieczorek-Zul, former German federal minister for economic cooperation and development, and very importantly, governor of the World Bank from 1998 to 2009, absolutely critical years in the story of aid and the story of policy cohesion. Heidi Marie.
Is it all right now? Can you hear me now? All right.
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thank you very much. And you see from the way we still exchange positions that we stay on in this fight, which is a fight which, well, where you always have to be along, be strong, show energy, and cooperate with others. And I specifically wanted to mention the fact that we supported the Millennium Development Goals. I was happy that in the Millennium General Assembly, when I could be present and see and also realize how afterwards the Millennium Development Goals could be put into practice. And as Hilde has outlined, we helped shape and finance the Debt Relief Initiative, which, and this I think is an important point, which overcame also the structural adjustment programs that so far had prevailed in the IMF and in neoliberal thinking. And well, the idea was that the development partners should use the financial relief in order to develop education, health, and the fight against poverty. And if I could say now, I would think today probably another debt relief would be necessary because the countries of the global south are suffering from the pandemic of COVID and its economic consequences, and poverty is growing. There has been this goalkeeper report which shows that poverty is on the rise once more. So this is one point, and certainly also the point of multilateral action against COVID-19, support of WTO and the ACT accelerator. One thing that is also mentioned in the book, which was very dear to my heart, was the fight against HIV/AIDS, which was one of the MDGs. And specifically, women were hit very much. And I remember our experience when the Utstein ministers went together to Tanzania, Evelyn, with the interesting airplane, which we could use at that time. And it was so shocking because that must have been in the year of 2000. It was so shocking because in a town hall meetings, the employer told us, the Tanzanian employers told us, if we employ one person now, we also employ the person who should replace him because we know he's going to die. And we, in all our countries, we tried to get this fight against HIV/AIDS across. And also we supported, for instance, the Global Fund to, after the 68 meeting in Geneva, the G8 meeting in Geneva. And this fund was agreed upon in 2001. And if this fight had not been taken up, I'm sure that the societies within African countries would have destroyed themselves, because then only elderly people and children would have survived. And fortunately, the fight has been successful to a certain extent because lives could be saved in the fight against AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. These successes were possible because we all fought for the fact that, there should be access to drugs, lower costs for health products for men and women. But could I also say now we have to be careful because there is the danger that COVID-19 will destroy the results of hard work. We must not allow such a process. And also where we joined forces related specifically to women, we supported the access of women in our partner countries to measures of family planning. And for instance, the UNFPA at that time, and women's sexual and reproductive rights. And when the US government, sometimes things repeat themselves, when the US government in 2002 cut the US contributions to UNFPA, the EU women ministers, specifically Evelyn, started an initiative to stand in for the lacking finance, which we did. And also perhaps to mention one initiative which joins, Hilda, Evelyn, and me, the fight for IPM, for the fact that women can protect themselves against HIV/AIDS. The initiative of IPN finally has come true because it was accepted by EMA for African countries in the middle of this year. And I think that is a wonderful success for women. And perhaps also as women ministers, we tried to get gender action into the World Bank because we said no country could and should dare to leave aside the wonderful potential of women in their respective countries. And the World Bank programs should focus more on strengthening women and supporting women. One last point I would like to mention is when I started as minister, I tried to help change the World Bank strategy to bring forward the fight against climate change and against the support of World Bank for fossil fuel projects. That was not easy at that time. Sometimes, members of the development committee looked at me wondering, what is she talking about? And we established a cooperation after specifically 2004, which made a new kind of coalition, a coalition of the willing, of about, more than 150 countries and parties, which supported the renewable energy in a conference in Bonn. And now we have the Paris Climate Agreement. We have the demand to decarbonize our economies. We have the SDGs, and the World Bank has created the Green Climate Fund, and the EU has put forward the Green Deal. But this is, of course, things that we have to do ourselves and where we have to be active. But we must also realize, and that is important also to talk it over with development partners, because all this puts pressure on developing countries, on African countries. And we have to see to it that we can support their initiatives and not make them dependent on, industrialized countries' decisions. I think that's a major point to get the SDGs across. And as Hilda said, we need the support, we need the cooperation, as we did in the fight against, when we had the debt relief. It was a coalition for debt relief, and now we have new initiatives, and those new initiatives and those countries that want to go forward have to go together. And I'm sure alliances, cooperation, and this type of joint engagement will be the possibilities for the future, also in the fight against COVID-19.
Okay. Thank you very much, Heidi. I was just thinking as you were talking how far-sighted you four were as a group, the Utstein Group, on so many issues, among others, not just debt, but you just mentioned sexual and reproductive rights. That has to do with the autonomy and agency of women. And the Utstein Group was way ahead of the movement in the development community on that issue. And then climate change and the role of the World Bank in climate change, where I think it was very fortunate that one of the members of the Utstein Group was from a G8 country, Germany, that has always been the champion in the G8 and the G20, indeed, the issue of climate change. So thank you, Heidi. Let's go now to Evelyn Herfkens, Minister for Development Cooperation in the Netherlands, 1998 to 2002, founder of the UN Millennium Campaign, and inspiration to me, frankly, ever since. Evelyn.
Thank you. After all that has been said about what we did, I think we should also acknowledge with some modesty that we actually were pretty lucky. Around the turn of the century, the stars were aligning and our economies were doing really well. So there wasn't much pressure of colleagues to steal money from our budgets. We could spend it the way that we wanted, and there was not that much pressure to use that money to promote our own export interest. There was enlightened leaderships in international organizations, as Hilde just mentioned. The United States was surprisingly cooperative. They came aboard on debt relief, and Bush actually went to the Finance and Development Conference in Monterrey, and they pledged billions, and they actually spent billions for, indeed, particularly fighting AIDS. And then we had tons of allies. We had good, strong constituencies in our own countries to do something about global poverty. We had fantastic people in our own ministries, but most importantly, in our partner countries and in the international organizations that we worked with. But the most important lucky thing we had was my fifth and last point on this, is that in Sub-Saharan Africa, at the time, governance and economic policy was incredibly improving. So there were all these reformers, these finance ministers, that we were able to help and to do things the way they should and wanted to, and do things better. So that was great. I also want to repeat the point that Hilde made about implementation. We did not invent the wheel. You know, I was cleaning up my archives. The Pearson Commission report in the 60s, the Brand Commission report in the 70s, evaluations ever since have advocated that donors move away from projects, that they should support country programs, that commitments should be multi-year, that aid should be untied from our own economic interest, and that our trade policies should serve also the objective of our development policies. So nothing new there. But you know what? We didn't invent the wheel, but as my former DG said, we actually made a turn. Implementation. That was the conspiracy. And thus we actually did help. We contributed to the way the developing countries were able to make tremendous progress towards meeting the Millennium Development Goals. A lot of that was actually achieved. And what I found the best thing is that the most progress was actually in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the news is all bad today. Things have really changed for the worse, but I still believe that every girl that went to school then because of these policies, and every child whose growth was not stunted because of these policies, I think has way better life than otherwise would. And so that is true too for their offspring, for their kids. So still something to celebrate after all these years. Now, since donors have been backtracking on a lot of these things that we have been advocating, and indeed with the pandemic, everybody talks about it, the future looks way more challenging, not just since we left, but since the book was written. For the first time in 3 decades, poverty is increasing, and not with a little. So the only silver lining that I see at this point is that everybody in the world now must see that what happens elsewhere actually impacts on our life as much. And thus the world needs more international cooperation, more multilateralism, more solidarity. And of course, every single rich country can increase its aid budget, can work on making aid more effective, can do more on opening markets for products from poor people in poor countries. But what I think the most important message is of the book of us is that by doing it together, by exercising peer pressure on each other and on others, that actually you incredibly amplify action and thus amplify results. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Evelyn. As I said, there we go. A call to action, implementation, a call to arms. Okay, we now go to, thank you, the three of you, really fantastic. We now go to Jim Adams, senior official at the World Bank for many years, vice president for East Asia and the Pacific, well known for his work in and of Uganda in his days at the World Bank, and for his wisdom on all of the issues you've been hearing about. Jim, including country ownership. Jim.
Yeah. Thanks, Nancy. Actually, the book talked about Tanzania, so I'm going to focus a little more on Tanzania. And believe it or not, in spite of all the nice things the book said, the Utstein Group actually had more of an impact in Tanzania than suggested by the book. And I'll just go through the issues that I think really did make a difference to the program. And while the book also talked about some of the most recent developments in Tanzania, which are not as positive, the Utstein Group and its work provided an enormous impact on Tanzania from when I started in '95 and Mkapa was elected president, literally until 2015. And you had a country that in 1995 had 30% inflation and no growth. And during the period from then to 2015 actually emerged with growth averaging over 6% and low single-digit inflation. Now, there was only one challenge for the group on economic reform when they met with the public in Tanzania, which they did, not terribly typical of ministerial visits. The first question to them, and I don't know whether they remember it, but I remember it well, was a criticism of the economic reform program. And why are we doing this? What are the costs? In spite of the early results that were quite positive. And Claire Short, who's not here, responded to it and gave a lecture about how economic reform was central to Tanzania. And I think that message coming from this group, filled with largely socialist members of government, was really powerful in Tanzania. But it didn't stop there. Work we had done before the visit drew in the Utstein Group, and here I focus on certainly poverty reduction and their emphasis on the Millennium Goals, had an increasingly important impact in Tanzania. Those two, I don't think we picked it up as strongly before the visit as we did after the visit. The message was so clear and powerful that this was going to drive resource decisions, that the donor group as a group responded to it. The PRSP story and the PRSP, which is being pushed by the group, took a particularly interesting turn in Tanzania. The Tanzanians to this day are very proud of the fact that the first PRSP written by a government that was accepted by the bank and the fund was the Tanzanian PRSP in 2000. And I think that, again, very much encouraged by the message about government ownership and how government support would be important to providing credibility to reform programs, a willingness. Subsequently, of course, Tanzania moved forward HIPC and was one of the early HIPC receivers. And so that benefit certainly acquired to Tanzania. And on the domestic side, it was particularly interesting. The late Benjamin Mkapa, who tragically passed away a couple months ago, did complete an autobiography. And in that autobiography, he told the story about how he went to Nyerere before Nyeri's death and said, "We are going to get HIPC. The bank assures me we are going to get HIPC." Nyerere was very skeptical, and tragically, he did not live to see HIPC. But within a year and a half of Nyeri's death, Tanzania did receive HIPC, and that provided an enormous impetus to increased resources available to the government. We drank all the Kool-Aid with respect to policy lending and sector lending, moved forward very aggressively with education and health and policy lending. We did one of the first poverty reduction support credits in Tanzania, again, very much in this atmosphere created and supported by the Utstein Group, which certainly allowed us, I think, to move very aggressively, certainly by bank standards. And I have to say, we didn't have to do one thing that happened in many other African countries. Many other countries that I spoke to resented a bit that in order to qualify for HIPC and get the additional support, they were being forced to do more in education and more in health. Donors were forcing government decision-making. That didn't happen in Tanzania, I think largely because of the multi-donor work on public expenditure reviews. So as long as the program was consistent with the public expenditure review, and in particular Mkpa's support for increased education, that was supported and in fact did not involve major conditionality with respect to HIPC. We did a lot of things on donor cooperation. The final thing I talked about was about AIDS. AIDS was not receiving very much attention in Tanzania. I was under enormous pressure from my management to do more, and I kept saying, we need ownership first, we need ownership first. Well, when I briefed President Mkpa before the mission came, the Utstein mission came, and he asked me what was going to happen, I told him he had one problem, and that was AIDS, because he hadn't been doing very much in AIDS. And he was getting a very strong message on that. And so I said, one of the things you can wear is, be sure to wear your AIDS button to the meeting, because at least that'll show you're thinking about it. So I went back to my office. 10 minutes later, I got a call from State House. Do you have an AIDS button that we could borrow? So I've got an AIDS button in very quickly. And I'm proud to say the program strengthened enormously with the strong support of the president after that. And almost every time I saw him after that, certainly in respect to donor function, he was always wearing his AIDS button. Just a final thing is that Heidi talked about Germany's changes. I can tell you at the country level, Germany was not part of what we call the like-minded group before the Utstein mission arrived. I can tell you after the meeting, anything they could do for me to strengthen aid coordination and help was certainly reflected in the work that was done. And so I think it was an enormous example of where this intervention, not just the visit, but I think more importantly, the signals that were coming from this group had an enormous impact on the program. If I could, I'd just like to shortly talk about my subsequent role, because all of this very much played an important role. Subsequently, I came back to the bank and I worked on operational policy. That group became a leader both in contributing to the Rome and Paris meetings and in supporting more broadly in the bank more use of things that were being done just not in Tanzania, but across Africa to improve the bank's performance as a leader of the donor community. And in that effort, we had the really strong support of senior bank management, particularly Jim Wolfenson, and it did make enormous difference, I think, in terms of what we were able to do. It was one of the few times where we actually seconded a person to DAC to work on the preparations of the Rome and the Paris meetings. And I think, the bank was seen certainly as an important supporter of that activity. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Jim. I saw Heidi Marie smiling when you were referring to Germany's role.
Could I perhaps just say one word related to that? That we were going to Tanzania and discussing the question of, the health cooperation in the country made me overcome the tendencies which at that time existed in our ministry. So it was also helpful for me to get across, and it helped the initiatives you told about. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I think that was great, Jim. It gives a sense of the breadth and depth of the Utstein Group's influence. It makes me wish the Utstein Group would somehow found a successor to it. Now we go to Bert Koenders, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands in 2014 to 17, member of the Dutch House of Representatives before that, and Minister for Development Cooperation also in the late 2000s, an expert on all things about aid effectiveness, and poverty and development. Bert.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you for the CGD. This is really an honor and a great pleasure to be on the launch of this book. I think it should have a lot of publicity because, and Kostas, the thanks is first to you. I think this is an excellent, it's lively, it's illuminating, and it's, in my view, a very actual book. I mean, here history can teach us something for the present day. Everybody has said that in a time of rising inequality, of deficient multilateralism, of the unprecedented consequences of the corona crisis for poverty that others have mentioned. I think it is actual because it shows that politics can, under certain circumstances, make a difference. And I think it still can. In this case, if 4 women conspire, if they work with many others, and they have a very targeted, almost political strategy of who their network is and how they can sort of pursue their policies, how they dare, and I think that was important, to withstand the dominant economic paradigm in the time of at that time on debt and trade, including many elements of the structural adjustment policies, to convince their own governments first. I think that's very important. I saw Evelyn, I was a member of parliament, doing that in our country, making sure that development is really a cornerstone of international policy. We see again a retreat from that. I'll come back to it in a second. To work together on the goals, I think that's the next lesson learned in the book. But I think some of you mentioned it, the key is implementation. I think in all the work, the combination of what I saw and why I admire the Utstein Group and the spirit of the Abbey is this combination of vision, of strategy, alliance, and implementation. And sometimes, you know, you only do 1 or 2 and then it doesn't really work. I remember very well at that time, I was just, you know, carrying the suitcases of these ladies. But they inspired me on working in their line of thought when I was later on a development minister and working at present, for instance, for the World Bank. I remember, Evelyn, we set up this group of parliamentarians at the time of the G10 nations. They existed at that point still, to make sure that we knew who was actually in the end going to pay for something, including debt relief, and ensuring that it actually came into their budgets. These seem to be details, but they're politically, of course, very relevant. And Heidemarie, I think you learned me to conspire. I remember our meeting during the Wolfowitz affair in the Development Committee, which became somewhat historic. I think the key elements of ownership, results, debt relief, if additionally financed, in combination with the really everywhere the poverty approach, the untying of aid and the delivering as one, were all ideas that were assembled by the Utstein Group in a common setting, which I think was important to see the links between the macro, the meso, and the country level. And I thought that was very inspiring. I think on the issues of especially the poverty approach, and also on results, I think we've made enormous progress. I see also big risks. I'm coming back a bit after foreign policy, you could say, to the development field. I'm still amazed. I just came back from the Sahel countries, the lack of aid coordination, the lack of the willingness to use and emancipate country systems. So there's still a lot of work to do. And especially your work on coherence requires, I think at this time, new actuality. When we talk about globalization, regional value change, trade, what does it mean for developing countries right now? The point that I want to make, and I don't want to be very long because others have made it, you did this at a specific strategic point at the end of the 90s. With this enormous debt overhang that paralyzed development, structural adjustment without a human face. Nobody had heard, I think, in political terms of coherence for development, although many had studied it, including on trade. There was a lot of tying of aid, and it was very popular to tie aid, and in some countries it comes back. But what I think was the crucial is to link all that to the G7, to the G8, to the IMF, to the World Bank, and to the visit. So to set it in an environment that became highly political. And of course, others have mentioned this. I think it's maybe just in my last 1 or 2 minutes important to say, because that's why I think the book can inspire us. Could we build a similar strategy right now? And who would be the actors? Others will have to decide on that. Definitely it should be women. I completely agree. We have Kristalina, we have the central bank boss at the moment in Europe. There are women who I think have a heart for these issues. But we need, I think, coalitions north-south right now. I think Europe could play a major role. Heidemarie, again, as you know better than I, Germany has a major role to play. We are waiting the debate tonight in the US, Biden-Trump, but nevertheless important that especially also Europe and other countries in the South try to build something similar with similar strategies for the time right now, when we have a deficient multilateral system and a much more inward-looking world for understandable but often wrong reasons, to build a similar thing. Look, I don't have to tell all the experts around here, we have 100 billion in global remittances, less to developing countries, 100 billion of retraction of private investment, 90 billion of illicit flows going out of Africa, a shock which is the broadest since 1870, rising food prices, and I think a pandemic that plunges, especially in the secondary effects of corona in Africa, but also in Latin America and parts of Asia, pushes us back. I don't think that's a reason to be, I mean, the future is unclear. We know this is going to happen. And we see at the same time, I think, to be very fair, of course, the IMF has disbursed 30 billion, I think, in emergency financing. The World Bank, which I see the staff working very hard on this. It's really tremendous. But we will still see if that 160 in the present and coming period will first, and probably it will. But in the end, we know that actually in poor countries, there is $4 ahead for cyclical policies. We have in Europe, in my own country, over 700. So we need, in terms of vaccines and in terms of the new debt overhang to come and the complications with China and so on and so forth, a new organizational principle, I would say, a conspiracy to work on these issues related obviously to this specific supply and demand shock, and again related to first and foremost poverty. And my learning of this inspiring book is new leaders, North-South, women, also with the private sector and the banking sector, relate again finance, debt and trade as well. I think we can look for new actors also in the European Union and elsewhere. And I think, and that's absolutely my last point, and that's why I was so happy to be part of this today. In the end, the personal narrative of all these four women is, I think, important. Whatever reason they went into politics, and some wanted always to go only in development and maybe others also in other areas, was their personal commitment to poverty eradication as a reason to be in politics. And I think that in the end created the room for maneuver. And that is why I would also say everybody read this book.
Thank you very much, Bert. So you've all been just great, all inspiring. I have hundreds of things that I want to say, but I won't. We have about 15 minutes now for questions and responses. And I want to give Kostas the last word, because I'm sure he has a lot of reactions to what he's heard. And maybe he wants to focus a little bit on the future, the current, because the book, of course, goes back, but now we're in a tougher situation, as Evelyn said and others have said, multilaterally in every way, and we have COVID. So let me go to the first question, which was for Heidi Marie, but I think any of you might want to comment briefly on it. And it's a question about the change since the early 2000s with the creation of the vertical funds. The Global Fund, the Global Partnership for Education, Gavi, and so on. Has that been a good thing, is the question. With hindsight, do you regret the support given by the Utstein Four for vertical funds? This is a question from Jaap Roymans, Stichting NICC, Netherlands International Cooperation Collective. So start with you, Heidi. He directs it to you, but any of the others. But, 30 seconds, like on the radio.
Well, actually, that was a point we discussed very much upon when the book was written. And I can say, well, in theory, I'm against vertical funds. But in the situation where millions of people were dying, it was necessary to grasp the possibility, finance the fund, and save more than 38 million people's lives.
Right. Others from the group? Evelyn says no. Hilda, are you there? I don't have you up on my screen. Okay. Yeah, let's be practical. I think that was the answer. Sometimes one thing works, another thing times another.
Yeah, I can chip in just briefly and just say that there was a concern about vertical funds amongst the group, and we did discuss it at great length, and we had a certain difference of views, but in the end, I think what we all saw was that the existing systems did not deliver at scale and quickly enough, and I think that's where we kind of have ended up, all of us. And I think the acknowledgement is, if UNAIDS could have done what the Global Fund is doing, of course it would be better, but unfortunately we didn't see that happen. So that is the challenge. The same with UNICEF and Gavi. So the performance of the existing organizations have not been strong enough. And hence so it's a default issue, but I think the proof now in what has happened after these years will show that actually they have delivered significantly. So I think we've ended up in acknowledging that, all of us.
Okay, am I on? You can hear me, yes.
It's one remark. You know that this is the one and only issue of everything ever discussed where we actually had difference of opinions at the outset.
That's
so
true.
It's really funny that you got the first question right there.
Well, there we are.
What helped, of course, was Kofi Annan had suggested it. You don't say no then, do you? But it's really the one and only issue. Okay.
I think it captures very nicely the point that women sometimes are sensible and practical and look at reality, not at theory or ideology, and can change their minds. At least some of you did, apparently, if not all of you, but I suspect all of you in the medium term that maybe these vertical funds have been better at raising resources from donors by focusing on issues that the larger world can understand. The second question comes from Anima Sharma, who's a visiting professor at a university in India. And she's really raising the issue that, I forget which one of you raised, or which, I guess, Evelyn, that things are worse now, particularly with COVID. Is there anything any of you on the Utstein Group or Bert and Jim want to say about, well, if there were, by some miracle, an Utstein Group now, including 4 ministers from countries that are committed to the SDGs and the Paris Accord, what difference might it make, or how might it operate? Evelyn.
On the one hand, the issues are similar. It's again the debt overhang. Again, it's a health problem, but be very careful not to put everything on one disease and neglect other diseases. So it's a similar kind of issue that we dealt with. Also similar is that it all very much depends how developing countries themselves deal with it. You cannot be helpful as an outsider if you're not actually helping the policies that these governments themselves put in place. So we were lucky that we were able to have a lot of partner governments that were doing the right things. So the answer is on both sides. The issues can be done partly by rich countries and partly the countries themselves have to do better. But the one thing that I think is very important is we should absolutely prevent that the vaccines, when they come, go only to the rich.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have to go back and apologize to all of you who are listening. I forgot to say, if you want to pose questions, and it's really too late now, do it, but it's not too late to tweet a question, which we can be sure to direct to any of our speakers today who are not Twitter nuts. You tweet hashtag CGD talks. I think that's probably the most practical thing right now. I would like to give Kostas a few minutes to answer a question I have. You have a wonderful, I encourage anyone who looks at this book to go straight to the end. well, maybe not straight to the end, but to look at the end of the book is comments on the future. And it's kind of a gentle, nuanced critique of the SDGs. As so many, how do we organize as a community, an international community interested in development, poverty reduction, all of those things, into something that is easier to capture in terms of the sort of movements that surrounded the creation of the Millennium Development Goals, including the movement that the Utstein Group represented in and of itself. Kostas, do you want to say anything about how you see the future in a situation that is so different from what the situation was, as Evelyn said very eloquently, at the founding of the Utstein Group?
I think that I would like to try, I will try my hand. It's not an easy question. I suggest that, in fact, there is evidence that the youth is actually very committed to climate change. There's lots of stuff happening on climate change. The question is really whether we can organize the whole business of 17 SDGs to try to sort of organize them in some groups and some focus, because 17 is too many to try to focus on simultaneously. That, I think, is correct. But there are three things that I'm thinking about, one of which has to do, poverty has to be there, climate change has to be there. I think inequality is an interesting issue which also has to be there.
Okay.
And then you have, within that whole structure, you have different kinds of emphasis. Now, of course, given the question of health, again, health is of primary importance, but health and education, human beings, aspects of these should be focused on. My thinking is that that there is a need. The fundamental principle I said before, and I will keep back. I repeat it because I think it's very important. I was talking actually to Marina Ponti, who works on the SDGs in Germany, and one of the things that she focused on is the fact that we need to stress that individual behavior is critical to societally and global change. I mean, individuals, by acting in a sensible way, is going to be able to impact the global community. And trying to get that message across is very, very important. Now, the problem is that individuals in different countries right now, I mean, there is a very difficult situation regarding the lack of coherence in the approach that people have. And the approach has become too atomized. But I'm hopeful that, in fact, the youth actually will coalesce. And it's not going to happen in 6 months or in a year. It may take a little longer. But if that happens, I think there's hope for the world to go forward. I think it's an opportunity. I think Evelyn said this. Maybe we should try to think of this as an opportunity to get together rather than to fall apart. That's it.
Mute.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Kostas. Sorry, I wanted to hold up the book again and to celebrate this book because it's about the last 20 years and a little bit more, but it's also very much about the future. Very much, if anything, we need Utstein Group .2. So we really do, to kind of bring not only intelligence and thoughtfulness and policy savvy, but to bring back soul and spirit to ending global poverty. I see Masood, would you like to have the last word?
Thank you very much, Nancy. I was going to say that two things, if I may. One is I was at the receiving end if you like, both in the bank and then in the IMF, of a lot of these ideas and pressure from the Utstein ministers. And, I think what was really key about it is that you brought political level engagement and leadership based on analytical work and evidence. And so we couldn't respond to you as a political response because there was a backup of intellectual underpinning. And, coming back to what Bert was saying, going forward, we know now what needs to be done beyond what is being done to address the current pandemic. There are a dozen good ideas on the table. But what we don't have is the political level ownership of those ideas in a way that would say, this is the set of things we will push forward. And that, I think, the combination is what made it work. And I think is so critical as to what we need today. And to end, we could put up the picture. Nancy, I want to put up the picture of you and two of the Utstein members and Moises Naim. This is a picture from when you were getting the award for the Commitment to Development Award from CGD, the first one in 2003. So Heidelberg, you're not there, and Claire is not in the picture, but I just found this picture and I thought that's a very nice picture on which to end this particular gathering. Back to you, Nancy. You're on mute, Nancy.
Oh yes, fun to see the picture. Lovely way to finish us off, Masood. Congratulations to Kostas and to our four, as he says, the noble conspiracy, our four champions of the Utstein Group. Hope to see all of you who are participating today soon at the next CGD event. Please buy the book. You'll learn a lot for the future from lessons of the past.
And don't disappoint us.
And don't disappoint us. Inspired, as Costa says, by today's young people, especially young women.
Thank